There are people who can hide everything from others, except what they carry in their hearts. Every night when they turn off the light, the same question returns like a whisper that gives no rest. Does God still accept me after my divorce and after my new marriage? Some are ashamed to say it out loud. Others live in fear of being trapped in eternal sin. But today, you're going to hear something that no one has ever dared to tell you. Something that can completely change the way you see your own story. Before discussing divorce, guilt, remarriage, or any difficult decision that can mark a person's life forever, there's a starting point no one should ignore: the heart of God when He created marriage. Not marriage as we see it today, fragile, disposable, full of unrealistic expectations and untreated wounds, but marriage as God originally envisioned it, before pain, lies, betrayal, abandonment, or fear existed. To understand what can be restored, we first need to understand what was lost. When the Bible describes the moment God perceives Adam's loneliness, it is not merely recording a historical fact. It is revealing something profound about the Creator Himself. God is not indifferent to human loneliness. He did not create humankind to live in isolation, carrying burdens alone, trying to survive without support or companionship. The first problem mentioned in the Bible was not sin, it was loneliness. It is not good for the man to be alone. This phrase is not just an observation, it is a divine statement about human nature. No one is born to walk alone. And when God created woman, He didn't form her from clay, He formed her from Adam's flesh. That matters. It means that marriage is not an external, superficial, bureaucratic union. It is something that springs from the essence. God didn't make Eve as a creature beside, but as someone from within. This places marriage in a completely different place than culture places it today. Marriage is not simply finding someone with whom living together is pleasant. It is participating in a profound spiritual mystery. Two lives, two stories, two bodies, two futures, becoming one. But when we say this, some listen with nostalgia, as if gazing at an unattainable ideal, because current reality is far more complex, full of scars that didn't exist in Eden. The truth is that almost no one gets married thinking about the divine mystery of the covenant. Most marry seeking shelter, companionship, attention, protection, stability, and sometimes even escape from a difficult home. And when two wounded people form an alliance, they discover that wounds don't disappear just because there is love. On the contrary, marriage often reveals what was hidden, and this is precisely where many stumble, because they confuse God's dream with human performance. God never envisioned a marriage built on selfishness, silence, manipulation, violence, betrayal, pride, or control. He never planned for anyone to endure years of humiliation to avoid sinning. He never romanticized suffering. In the garden, Adam and Eve were not afraid of each other. They hid nothing, they didn't pretend. There was no guilt, no shame, no comparison, no power struggle. The original marriage was a safe environment where the heart could exist without fear of being hurt. But the world was never Eden again. After the fall, everything God created as holy became vulnerable. Perfect union turned into a daily struggle. Pure love became a battle between what we want and what we promise. And for that very reason, when we talk about divorce or remarriage, we are not just talking about religious morality, but about a clash between God's perfect plan and the imperfect condition of the human heart. Some people grow up thinking marriage is happily ever after. Others enter it without knowing how to love, without knowing how to communicate, without knowing how to forgive. Some carry childhood traumas that become destructive patterns within the relationship. Others never learn to trust. Many only reproduce the kind of love they saw at home: painful love, shouted love, broken love. It's impossible to talk about divorce without acknowledging that many people arrive at marriage already bearing deep scars, and God sees all of this. He knows the origins of the wounds that destroyed stories. He knows what no one else saw: the heavy silences, the hidden fears, the tears that no one understood. When Jesus speaks about marriage, He is not advocating for a social institution. He is advocating for a spiritual covenant that reflects something greater: God's committed, sacrificial, and faithful love for His people. True marriage is not a contract between two people, but a mirror of the divine covenant. And that is why there is so much suffering when this covenant is broken, because something sacred is torn from within. But here is the most important point of this chapter: The fact that God dreamed of something perfect does not mean that he demands that broken human beings live as if they were perfect. God does not present Eden as a demand, but as a reminder, a point of reference. He does not demand original purity from us, but calls us to seek it as much as possible, with grace and truth, not with condemnation. This is where many churches go wrong. They preach the ideal without looking at people's real conditions. They talk about the sanctity of marriage but ignore the pain that corrodes marriages from within. They demand fidelity without teaching healing. They demand commitment without offering a shoulder to cry on. The Bible doesn't do that. God never hid the fact that the human heart is complex. He never despised those who have fallen. He never commanded anyone to carry a cross placed there because of another person's sins. He never ordered anyone to remain in a relationship that destroys the original purpose of marriage. Today's chapter is here to remind you of this. You're not dealing with a God who demands you live as if the fall never happened. You're dealing with a God who knows the fall, knows the pain, knows the trauma, knows the story, knows what you've never told anyone, and yet he still calls you by name. Before talking about divorce and starting over, he reminds you, I created you to love and be loved, not to survive. God's dream for marriage is not a collection of rules, but a promise that two people can build together something so profound that no external storm can destroy it. But he also knows that sometimes the storm comes from within, and when that happens, he doesn't turn his face away, doesn't close his eyes, and doesn't demand that you die to appear faithful. He is the God who looks to the origin, to Eden, but walks with us in the desert. And it is into this desert that we will enter the next chapter, when the alliance becomes a wound, when love turns to fear, when marriage ceases to be a garden and becomes a battlefield. Some marriages begin with celebration, lights, whispered promises at the altar, and the feeling that nothing could ever destroy them. But as the years go by, some alliances are eroded not by a single event, but by thousands of cracks that no one immediately notices. This is how many people discover over time that marriage, that which should be a refuge, can transform into a place where the heart stops breathing. That's what we're going to talk about now. Not about theories, not about cold laws, but about the real ground where life happens and where many alliances break long before a divorce paper exists. To understand the depth of this topic, imagine 3 different stories. None of them are literal, but all are true for thousands of people. First story, a man tries to rebuild his home after infidelity. He forgives, tries to start over, tries to believe it was a moment of weakness, an emotional lapse. But the infidelity repeats itself, not once but several times. Broken promises, successive lies, hidden conversations, signs of contempt. Over time, he realizes he's not fighting to restore a marriage. He's fighting alone against the other person's decision to be unfaithful. And no matter how much society says always forgive, there comes a point where the soul screams, I can't take it anymore. Second story, a woman experiencing silent abandonment. There was no explicit betrayal, no slammed doors, no packed suitcases, but there was something even worse, absence. Year after year, the husband withdraws into himself, stops talking, stops showing affection, stops participating in family life. There is no violence, but there is a void. He is physically present, but his heart broke long ago. She tries to talk, tries to rekindle intimacy, tries to ask for help, and he responds with indifference. Until one day, she realizes she is living alone beside someone who has simply given up on the marriage, without the courage to say it aloud. Third story, someone living under violence, physical, emotional, or psychological. The kind of violence that never appears in church halls because the abuser smiles in public and seems like a model of spirituality. Emotional violence is as devastating as physical violence. Crushing words, constant humiliation, veiled threats, manipulation, control, silencing. Some are beaten by their spouse and led to believe that they need to endure it to please God. Some live in fear of sleeping next to the person who should protect them. Some hide scars not on their bodies, but on their souls. These 3 stories have something in common. They show that divorce rarely begins when the marriage ends on paper. More often than not, the pact has already been broken internally long before, not by the one who leaves, but by the one who destroys the alliance with repeated actions, moral abandonment, or extreme violence. And here's a fundamental truth. God is not complicit with abusers, repeat offenders, or emotional abandoners. He never has been. When Jesus speaks about the hardness of heart, he is not advocating a rigid law. He is exposing the root of deteriorating marriages. He knows that the human heart can become so insensitive, so trapped in selfishness, pride, and sin, that it ceases to honor the covenant. And when the heart hardens, no covenant can survive without a sincere choice of repentance and change. What Jesus does when speaking about marriage is not demand perfection. He confronts the selfishness that destroys the sanctity of the union. Therefore, when he says that divorce arises from hardness of heart, he is pointing to something profound. Divorce is a consequence of a broken covenant, not its cause. In many cases, the marriage no longer exists in spirit, even if it continues to exist on paper. And so we come to the two major biblical themes related to divorce: persistent infidelity and abandonment. Jesus speaks of the first, Paul speaks of the second. But before delving into the texts, one thing is necessary: to read the Bible with the same compassion that God looks upon his children. Because infidelity is not just the sexual act of betrayal. Abandonment is not just leaving home. Violence is not just physical aggression. There are more subtle yet equally destructive ways of breaking a covenant. Persistent infidelity is not a fall but a lifestyle. It's when someone consciously decides to maintain a parallel life, repeatedly break trust, and turn marriage into a lie. God doesn't require anyone to live in darkness to keep up appearances. Abandonment is when someone fails to fulfill the covenant, emotionally, morally, spiritually, and abandons the other to their own fate. When Paul says that a brother or sister is not bound, he is not condoning divorce as an easy option. He is acknowledging that when the other breaks the covenant and refuses to rebuild it, the innocent party should not bear the blame alone. And then comes the most painful part: the violence. God abhors violence. There is not a single biblical text that encourages anyone to tolerate abuse within a marriage. On the contrary, the Bible is extremely clear about cruelty. God condemns it repeatedly. Violence destroys the image of God in the other person. It violates everything that marriage should represent. When someone uses force, control, manipulation, or emotional terror, the covenant has already been broken. It was never God's plan for anyone to remain in physical or emotional danger to prove faithfulness. When we understand this, what once seemed like a rigid rule begins to transform into divine wisdom. God does not support divorces motivated by selfishness, but neither does he bind anyone to dead, violent, or abandoned alliances. He is the God of truth, but also the God of life. And life is always above religious appearances. Amidst these stories, repeated infidelity, abandonment that dries up the soul, violence that destroys the spirit, there is a question many are afraid to ask. If the pact was already broken, does God condemn me for leaving? The answer, seen in light of all this, is simple and profoundly liberating. No, God does not condemn those who flee to survive. He does not condemn those who try to rebuild their lives after being betrayed multiple times. He does not condemn those who need to protect their children from violence. God condemns the one who destroyed the covenant, not the one who escaped it to preserve their own life. But there's an important detail. Even when leaving is necessary, the soul takes time to understand. Because nobody enters a marriage planning to leave. Nobody gets married wanting to break a pact. Nobody wants to face the judgment of others or the weight of guilt. Therefore, the next chapter will deal with something even deeper. What to do when you are the one carrying the guilt for what happened, when you made a mistake, failed, or remarried without understanding the seriousness of the covenant. There are people who carry the pain of having been betrayed, abandoned, or hurt within their marriage, but there is another group, and this one often suffers in even deeper silence, who look back and think, "It was my fault." It's not easy to admit that. Some avoid the subject for years, others hide behind justifications, and some simply carry the weight like someone carrying a stone in their chest. This chapter is for those who spend nights remembering decisions they would like to undo, words they would like to take back, actions they wish they hadn't taken. It could be someone who divorced due to immaturity, impulsiveness, or lack of emotional preparedness. It could be someone who didn't know how to love, who didn't know how to communicate, who closed themselves off, who hurt first. It could be someone who betrayed, not just physically, but emotionally, when they turned their heart away from their spouse. It could be someone who gave up on the marriage too soon. And it could be someone who, after all that, remarried and is now in a new relationship, but carries the shadow of the past with them. The guilt that accompanies these people is very different from the pain of the victim. It's a hidden guilt. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't appear in the eyes, it appears in the conscience. And the worst part is that this guilt often mixes with spirituality. Many think, has God forgiven me? Does he accept my new marriage? Am I experiencing something he disapproves of? These questions are profound and often dangerous because they can paralyze the life of someone who is already trying to rebuild. And here is the first essential truth of this chapter. The God of the Bible is not the enemy of those who have erred. He is the God who restores those who acknowledge their error. Before we talk about current marriage, remarriage, or how to look to the future without fear, we need to talk about something fundamental: true repentance. Repentance is not a feeling of guilt that lingers for years. It is not repeated self-accusation, nor emotional martyrdom. Biblical repentance is change, not torture. It's as if God were saying, I don't want you to destroy yourself looking back. I want you to walk with me looking forward. Guilt paralyzes you, but grace moves you. And there is a very beautiful truth in the Bible that almost no one remembers when talking about divorce. God has always treated his children as people who start over. The entire history of God's people is made up of falls, failures, regrets, and new beginnings. God never demanded that anyone go back to the past to undo mistakes. He has always called people to live a new present under his guidance. That is why the gospel does not begin with an accusation, but with an invitation. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. A person who has made a mistake falls exactly into this category: tired, overwhelmed, internally conflicted. Someone who tries to be strong in public but feels a knot in their chest when they think about what could have been different. To understand how God views this type of pain, we can recall 3 biblical stories, different from those cited in the original video, that show how God deals with those who fail in their covenant. The first story is about the prodigal son. He completely breaks his father's trust, abandons home, squanders everything, and insults his family with his decision. He has no excuse. He has no justification. He didn't have a noble reason. He was wrong. He did what he shouldn't have. And yet, when he returns, the father doesn't demand that he rebuild his past. The father doesn't say, now you will pay for every mistake. The father doesn't order him to undo his history of sin. The father receives him from where he is, and from there rebuilds a new life. That is repentance. Returning, that is forgiveness. Receiving, that is grace. Starting over. The second story is about Peter. He promised absolute fidelity, steadfastness, courage. He said he would die for Jesus. But in the moment of greatest pressure, he denied his own master 3 times. He failed in what he swore to honor most, and this is very similar to someone who fails in marriage, promising something they cannot fulfill. When Jesus resurrects, he doesn't force Peter to live imprisoned in error. He restores him with a simple and painful question: do you love me? It's not an interrogation, it's an invitation to the truth. Peter weeps, confesses, and receives a new calling. He doesn't return to the beginning. God leads him to the next chapter. The third story is about Abraham. He tried to help God, acted impulsively, and made decisions without waiting for the promise. This generated pain, division, and consequences that changed generations. Even so, God did not discard him. He corrected him, guided him, led him forward, and fulfilled his promise. God's restoration does not erase the past. It illuminates it. These 3 stories have something in common. God doesn't erase mistakes. He redeems people. Now let's talk about the point that causes the most spiritual terror: remarriage. Some live in fear that their current marriage is invalid before God. Others think, do I need to separate again to correct the mistake of the past? This doubt crushes peace, steals joy, and creates a psychological torment that was never intended by God. Let's make something as clear and loving as possible. God never asks anyone to destroy their current marriage to fix a past mistake. Never. In no text, in no instruction, in no spiritual principle. God does not command you to repeat a divorce. God does not demand that you abandon your current family to pay for a marriage that started badly. This does not exist in the logic of grace. The Bible shows that what was born wrong can be restored if it is brought before God with truth. What needs to be transformed is not the family structure but the heart. If you've remarried, even if the beginning was confusing, rushed, or emotionally immature, what matters now isn't how it started, but what you do with that union today. The question isn't, was it right to start? The question is, do I consecrate this marriage to God now? God doesn't destroy families. He heals families. God doesn't command you to reverse relationships. He commands you to sanctify relationships. God doesn't demand that you fix the past. He calls you to live righteously in the present. And this requires some profound attitudes, taking responsibility for what happened, confessing before God without hiding anything, asking for forgiveness where necessary, and above all deciding to live the current marriage with a sincere commitment to love, fidelity, and truth. The past cannot be changed, but the future can be completely rewritten when the heart surrenders. Many people think that divine punishment is separation or eternal guilt, but punishment is not divine, it is human. God's grace does not keep anyone bound to yesterday. It opens doors so that tomorrow may be different. Your current marriage, if lived in the light, can become precisely the place where God will heal not only you but also your spouse, your home, your memory, and your history. Now that we've addressed guilt and starting over, we arrive at the crucial point: how to live after divorce and a new beginning. That's what we'll explore in the next chapter. After everything we've discussed, God's original dream, the wounds that break covenants, the guilt of those who erred, and the grace that restores, we arrive at the most practical and important point of this journey: how to live from here on out. Because no matter what your story is, whether you were hurt, whether you were the one who hurt, whether you left out of necessity, whether you started over out of love or desperation, there is a future before you. And that future doesn't depend on the past that brought you here. It depends on the God who calls you to walk with him from now on. Restoration isn't magic. It doesn't happen in a day nor in a prayer. It's not a button you press and everything goes back to normal. Restoration is a journey. And like any journey, it's traveled step by step, decision after decision, truth after truth. There are three main paths this journey can follow, each for a different kind of story. If you're reading this, you'll probably find yourself on one of them. First path, the path of someone who is divorced and hasn't yet started over. This person lives in a kind of emotional limbo, no longer in the past, but still unable to find their way to the future. Often they feel like they are walking through a field of rubble, picking up pieces of themselves, trying to figure out where the marriage ended and where their identity begins. This is the most important moment in post-divorce life. Not the moment to look for someone new, but the moment to seek God in a new way. When a person leaves a broken marriage, whether through their own fault or not, something inside them needs to die so that something new can be born. It's the death of expectations, illusions, dependencies, and repetitive patterns. And this death hurts. That's why many rush into a new relationship too soon, to escape the silence, to numb the pain, to avoid facing their own soul. But this isn't healing. It's escape. True restoration in this case begins with stopping, breathing, allowing yourself to feel, allowing God to touch the wounds you've tried to ignore for years, allowing him to show you the difference between loneliness and solitude. Solitude is the space God uses to rebuild you, piece by piece, without haste, without pressure, without fear. This period is essential to avoid repeating the same mistakes of the past in the future. Emotional healing is the first pillar of restoration. Second path, the path of those already in a new marriage. For these people, the question isn't, did I do the right thing? But rather, what do I do with what I have now? And the answer is profound. Transform your new marriage into an altar, not a hiding place. Don't live this relationship carrying ghosts from the past, fear of failure, accumulated guilt, or unrealistic expectations. Live it truthfully. The restoration here involves three internal processes. The first step is to fully embrace the present. This means stopping comparing your current marriage to your previous one. It means stopping measuring your current spouse by the behavior of your former spouse. It means stopping living trapped in memories. This marriage is different, with a different soul, a different history, a different purpose. Don't turn it into a continuation or repair of the previous one. It's a new construction. Treat it as such. The second step is to heal what you brought from the past instead of dumping it into the present. Many people start a new marriage thinking the problems have disappeared when, in reality, they've only changed scenery. Jealousy, insecurities, emotional blocks, old traumas, unrealistic expectations, all of this travels with you if it's not confronted. Restoration requires emotional courage, looking inward, asking for forgiveness, asking for help, talking about what hurts, letting the light into areas you've tried to hide. The third step is to consecrate your current marriage as a covenant. Many marriages begin without this awareness, but God isn't concerned with how something began, but rather with how it continues. Bring God to the center of your relationship. Decide to love in a mature, conscious way. Build rituals of trust, regular conversations, transparency, prayer together, clear boundaries. Transform your home into an environment of healing, not of comparison, demands, or fear. Third path. The path of those who have experienced abuse, violence, or emotional destruction. This is the group that most needs spiritual, emotional, and practical protection. Those who have suffered abuse need not only restoration, they need safety. And this means something very important. The first step is not spiritual, it's physical. Protecting oneself, seeking support, having a support network. God never called anyone to die within a marriage. After safety comes emotional restoration. Violence creates deep cracks in identity. It destroys a person's confidence in themselves, in God, in others. Therefore, this path requires time, therapy, community support, and inner reconstruction. God does not rush those who have been wounded in this way. He walks alongside them, removing guilt that shouldn't exist, restoring dignity, restoring voice, restoring life. And then comes the point that almost no one talks about. After a person experiences trauma, they need to rebuild their capacity to love, and that takes time. It requires patience with oneself. It requires knowing how to recognize emotional triggers. It requires relearning how to feel safe. The restoration here is not linear. It happens in waves. And God does not abandon anyone in these waves. He sustains, He heals, He lifts them up. But beyond these three individual paths, there is an element that runs through them all: community. Restoration is not a process to be experienced alone. There are people who try to deal with everything in isolation, afraid of being judged. Others remain silent because the old church hurt them, or because they heard cold speeches that do not reflect the heart of God. But the truth is that no one heals completely in isolation. It is necessary to find a place, even a small one, where you can be heard, welcomed, and reminded that your story is not over. A healthy community does two things. It protects and guides. It doesn't pressure, judge, or impose burdens. It helps people see their dignity, understand grace, and walk with wisdom. God created faith to be lived in companionship, not for you to carry alone a weight that breaks you from the inside. Finally, there is something essential: forgiveness. Not the superficial forgiveness that pretends to forget, but the deep forgiveness that frees the heart from bitterness. There are relationships that should not be resumed, but that need to be closed within the soul. Forgiveness doesn't bring back the past. It opens the doors to the future. It doesn't say the other person was right. It says you choose freedom. Forgiveness gives the heart back the ability to breathe. After that comes the final step: honoring the covenant that exists now. It doesn't matter how it began. It doesn't matter what happened before. It doesn't matter how many mistakes there are in your history. If your current marriage is under God's light, treat it as sacred. Love with maturity, respect deeply, forgive generously, and live with the awareness that God is rewriting your story, not from ruins, but from grace. Because the truth is this: divorce may have destroyed a bond, but it didn't destroy you. And God doesn't write endings on torn pages. He writes new beginnings. If you want me to revise something, expand on it, or turn it into a narrative version, just ask.